Tare mult, asta discutam cu toți colegii și mă bucur că suntem și colegi din industrie, dar și mulți oameni doritori să afle cum este să înveți, cum învățăm mai bine. Spuneam că mă bucur că ne vedem pentru prima dată în multă vreme la un eveniment fizic, cel puțin pentru noi la Curtea Veche Publishing. Eu mă numesc Marius Motoca, reprezint editura, sunt chiar al editurii. Ce pot să vă spun este că în seara asta e ceva special pentru noi. Barbara ne-a anunțat că vine în România și am zis că nu putem rata ocazia. Am făcut tot posibilul, iată, avem contextul necesar să facem totuși un eveniment fizic și ne bucurăm tare mult că sunteți alături de noi. În caz că nu știați deja, evenimentul va avea loc în limba engleză și pentru că voi face o scurtă introducere despre Barbara, am să mă mut în limba engleză, dacă îmi permiteți. So, Barbara, I said I'll be switching to English now, so that you can hear,
I can understand
so that you can understand what I'm going to say about you.
Uh-oh.
If there are bad things, I want you to know. So I met Barbara just a few days back, and within, I don't know, 10, 15 minutes after I met her at the airport, we were already chatting away about pretty much anything. Politics, economics, culture, and everything in between, for that matter. And a few days into our chats, it's pretty clear that Barbara isn't just an educator, and not just one of the most well-known experts on learning techniques in the US and maybe the world. And she's also a very, very eager learner herself. She's a lifelong student, if I may be permitted to say that. Now, that becomes very obvious if you start... I'm sorry, I'm a bit nervous. I'm usually not nervous at these things. You can see that, and I'm sorry for that. We haven't done an event in quite a while. So it's very obvious when you start to read about her. And you know, she was born in Lodi, California. She joined the army after finishing high school. And she got a BA, I think, a BA in Slavic languages and literature. That's where we have something in common. Slightly something. She was then sent to Germany because you joined the army, right? And after leaving the army, if I'm not mistaken, you got your diploma in engineering at the University of Washington. And she is also currently, and please correct me if I'm wrong, a professor emeritus of engineering at the University of Oakland.
No, I'm actually just a distinguished professor, not yet retired. Not yet.
Okay. Sorry about that. But she also developed an online course on Coursera. Some of you already know it. And from what I know, and I'm sorry I didn't know this before, that course has already been taken by at least 3 million people?
Yes. Yeah.
I mean, if that number doesn't impress you, I'm sure the presentation that follows will. The book that you see on the table is the first book that we've published, Barbara's first book that we've published. There are 2 more coming in July and September, so do watch our social media channels. And you will see that we kept the main English title, Mindshift. And not just because you don't have an equivalent in Romanian for that, but also because I think there's a very particular way that Barbara makes you understand things. And maybe some of the things that you will hear today, maybe you already know them. But the way that Barbara makes connections is quite unique. So this is the starting point. This book is one of the many starting points for today's presentation. So yeah, without any further ado, I think it's time to learn how to learn. Barbara, you have the floor.
Oh, okay. Well, let's see. Thank you so very much, Marius, and thank you to Carte Publishing, because I really can't tell you how much I appreciate you bringing me out here, and I am here on their behalf. So I'd like to just give you a little sense of, well, first, I want to begin by telling you about my very favorite athlete of all time. So let's see if I can advance this. Oh, we have a little bit of a problem here. Oh, okay, it's one of those things. Okay, let's see if I just want to make sure. Okay, so I want to tell you about my favorite athlete of all time, and that is Julius Yego. And Julius is from Kenya. So if you know anything about Kenya, they're famous for their long-distance runners. Look at his arms. They're like huge. He's not a long-distance runner. And indeed, Julius always wanted to learn to throw the javelin, you know, the spear. It's an Olympic sport. And so, but there weren't any javelin throwing coaches in all of Kenya, and he couldn't afford to go overseas and study. So he just started watching YouTube videos. And do you know that almost like 98% of the time, by just watching YouTube videos and going out and practicing on his own, he became the world champion in throwing the javelin. So this tells you, I think, some important things. And one of them is you can learn a lot that you thought you never could learn, and you can learn it on your own using some of the new insights, not only through reading wonderful books, which are the foundation of our learning, but also through these great new mechanisms of online learning. So I think it's important for us all to recognize that it's possible to really change your direction in life. And you can do this whether you're young or even, as I'll show you, when you're older. Now, just to give you a little bit of inspiration, my grandfather, for example, was one of these cowboys. He was very good on horseback, and he drove cattle down in New Mexico. And the thing is, that was, in those days, being able to build a saddle on a horse was really valuable. But guess what? Nowadays, people really don't need saddles so much. And in fact, horses, although I love them, it's not really a major technology that is keeping everything alive. There's been enormous transitions in this past century, and people have had to change all the way along. So we'll be talking about career change and transitions through this talk. Transitions often involve learning. So of course, we'll be talking about the neuroscience of learning. And can adults learn, change, and grow? I'm living proof, and we all are, that we can indeed do this. So just a little bit about myself to begin with. I grew up moving all over the United States. So by the time I was about 15 years old, I lived in 10 different places. Now the thing is, I was 7 years old, and I was living here in Texas, so I'll still talk just like this, which is a Texas drawl, if you're familiar with it. So I moved to Massachusetts, 7 years old, and suddenly they were very far ahead of me in the multiplication tables. I thought, oh, I don't like math anyway. And I didn't know how to do the multiplication tables, and I was very slow at learning them. So I just, instead of actually learning them and catching up with the other children, I just gave up. I thought, oh, you know, I don't have the math gene. And I flunked from then on, from 7th grade all the way through 18 years old, flunked my way through elementary, middle, and high school math and science, which is a little ironic, seeing as how I am speaking with you here today as a distinguished professor of engineering. So one day, one of my students asked me, he found out about my terrible, sordid past as a math flunky and said, how did you do it? How did you change your brain? And I thought about it. I mean, I was this little girl, and I love this picture of me because it is the last cute picture of me. And I love animals and knitting and weaving and those kinds of things. And I thought, well, I can never grow up and do anything technical. So I thought, I'd like to learn another language. Now, I know for you sitting here, you're going, this is silly. We speak a lot of different languages in this room. But remember, for me, I just spoke English, and I thought, wouldn't it be cool to see the world through several perspectives, the perspective of a first and a second language. So if you're not a multilingual person, that seems pretty exotic. So I thought, you know, how can I do that? Because I couldn't afford to go to college. I realized there was one way I could learn a new language and get paid for it. And that was to join the Army. So this is me. This is me looking like super nervous because I'm about to throw a hand grenade. And if you knew how clumsy I am, you would know why I look so nervous. But I did learn another language. I learned Russian. I obviously should have learned Romanian. And I ended up working on Soviet trawlers up in the Bering Sea. I just loved having new adventures and seeing the world through new perspectives. So I also ended up at the South Pole Station in Antarctica. That's me. You can't see me very well, but I'm actually just looking really cold. But this is where I met my husband. So I always say I had to go to the end of the earth to meet this wonderful man. And there he is. He's all the way in the back there. He's laughing and waving. So, it's been 38 wonderful years, and I would not be here speaking with you if it wasn't for my husband and his wonderful support and brilliant ideas. So the thing is, though, I was 26 years old, and I was going to get out of the Army, and I began to realize something. I had done everything that people had told me to do. I had followed my passion and learned a new language, but I had followed my own passion, and I hadn't really thought about the idea of what does the world need? Not just what do I need, but what does the world need? What I should have been doing was, instead of just following my own passion, I should have been looking at what about broadening my passion? That is, learning what I'm interested in, but also learning about more. In fact, learning about things that can maybe even also advance me in a career that I may want to be doing. Because it turns out, when you follow your passions, guess what? Lots of people have the same passions. So that means when you go out in the working world, guess what? You're competing with a lot of people who have similar passions to you. So if you broaden your passions, that is, learn what you want to be learning, but also be learning something a little more broadly, what can be surprising is, as you broaden your passions, you can be learning these broader skills, and you'll fall in love with them. And that's what happened to me, in fact. Remember how I hated math? I love math. And part of that is just overcoming that initial learning curve. When you're learning to ride a bicycle, for example, what are you doing when you're riding a bicycle? You fall down a lot, right? It hurts. It's really uncomfortable doing that learning. But after you get over that initial hurdle, it becomes easier. In fact, it becomes really fun. And many, many skills are like that. In the beginning, they're very difficult, but as you get better at them, they get more fun. They get really interesting. So I think what we should do now is we should look inside the brain. What happens when you are changing your brain, when you are learning something new? The brain, as we know, is really complicated, but if we look at it, it has a very, very simple fundamental building block, and that is the neuron. And I know what you're doing. You're sitting there thinking, this is the super boring part of her talk, where she gets into this science stuff. Icky, icky, ah. But let's spice things up a little bit with a metaphor. So here's our metaphor for a neuron, and our metaphor is a space alien. So we can see here our space alien has 3 legs, and these legs are analogous to what are called dendrites on real neurons. And those legs, you can see they've got these things like toes on them, and the toes are like what's called dendritic spines. And then there's like this arm that goes up, and that arm is called an axon. So what happens, this is what neurons love to do. They love to do this thing called playing footsie, right? They reach out and they tickle the toe of an adjoining neuron. That's what neurons love to do. What they're really doing is they're reaching out and they are sending electrical signals that pass along and jump this gap called a synapse and go on to the next neuron. That's what neurons do. And what this is really doing is this is making a set of connections between neurons in long-term memory as you're learning anything new. So whether you're learning how to do a dance step, or you're learning how to take a derivative in math, how to conjugate a verb, how to play a chord on the piano, whatever you are learning, you are just making connections between neurons in long-term memory. So when people tell you things like this, you don't need to memorize this stuff. You can always look it up. They're wrong. Because could I speak Romanian if I always just went to Google Translate and looked it up? Of course not. In fact, you need to have that neural architecture, whether you're learning the multiplication tables or whatever you're learning. Those key ideas form a structure in your brain. So as you practice with whatever you're learning, you are strengthening those sets of neurons. Or the links between those neurons. The more you practice, the stronger those sets of links become, until eventually it's this very nice, strong set of links. And those links are what you can easily pull to mind whenever you're trying to think about, how to solve a problem, or how to speak in a foreign language, or whatever you might be learning. So this brings me, it's quiz time. So everybody gets to vote. So you're going to have 4 things to vote on. And what I'm going to ask you is, what is the most powerful technique? And this is not like just a little bit better. It's like way better than any other technique for learning. So I'm going to give you 4 things, and then we're going to have a show of hands. So get in mind which one you think is best. First one, rereading. I don't know about you. I have done a lot of rereading during my life because that is repeating things, repeating ideas. A second approach is to highlight or underline. How many used books have we purchased that have all sorts of highlights and underlines in them? Or is it retrieval practice or recall? By this I mean things like using flashcards. You look at the flashcard, see if you can retrieve the idea from your mind, and then maybe check and see if you've got it. And the final technique is to use a concept map. That is to write down the key ideas and then see if you can connect those key ideas together. Okay, so now we're going to have our active exercise. How many vote for rereading? If I have a brave person, okay. Okay, so we've got like 5 people, okay. How many highlighting or underlining? Okay, so we've got maybe 3 or 4, yep. Retrieval practice. Okay, maybe 5, 8, maybe 8. Creating a concept map. Okay. Ha! I fooled you. Because, see, but here's the thing is, if you know anything about education, you've often been taught it's concept maps that are the great thing. That's the best way of learning. But nobody actually went and checked. And when they did a study to see which of these techniques was the best, guess what it was? It was retrieval practice. Like, oh yay, you did it, you got it, okay. So, and concept mapping wasn't anywhere even close to as good as retrieval practice. Why? We can see now why this is true. If you look, when you're learning something, so like right now when I'm explaining something, these ideas are forming this weak set of links in your brain. But each time, so like after the talk this evening, on your way home, if you will speak with your mother and say, these are the key ideas I got from this talk, you're retrieving those key ideas, and each time you retrieve those ideas, it is strengthening those ideas in your own mind. So this indeed is why retrieval practice is so invaluable for learning. And so at whatever you're learning, like if you're walking home and it's safe or whatever, try to think, what were the key things that I was learning today? What was the most important thing? Because what this is actually doing, it's reinforcing the sets of links about what that thing is, and also about what that thing is not, like compared to other different things. So you're really learning valuable ideas. So what happens though, when I'm teaching a class, I will sometimes, so here's what happened once. I was teaching this statistics class, and I remember this one student, he came up to me and he just flunked my test. He thrusts the test in my face and says, I don't understand how I could have flunked this test because I understood it when you said it in class. We've gotten so kind of crazy about the idea that conceptual understanding is the key to learning that we've forgotten that you can understand something conceptually, but if you don't have it in long-term memory, you will forget it. In fact, if you don't use it, your little synaptic janitor will just sweep those dendritic spines away. So this is why it's very, very important to retrieve those ideas and do so over a number of days. What's really happening is when you're learning, so you are all now budding neuroscientists, and this, you'll recognize, is a dendrite. That's that leg of the neuron. And these are dendritic spines. And this is a real live neuron, or a light microscopy image of one. And this is before learning and before sleep. So think about it. What would this neuron look like after learning and after sleep? Is it going to have a really fat? Is it going to be fatter here? Is it going to maybe have more dendritic spines? What do you think? Do I have a brave person? I see it growing in some of your minds. Yes, I see. And there was a hand in the back. Yes. So it would have more of these dendritic spines? So after sleep, it will have more dendritic spines? Exactly right, yes. It will have some more dendritic spines and also some that have been erased. So look here. There was no dendritic spine here before, but after learning and after sleep, this spine grew. And also some spines fall away during sleep. So it's like carving out this pattern of what you know. Exactly right. And so this is part of why sleep is such an important aspect of learning. You don't want to be like forcing yourself to be, okay, I'm only going to have 2 hours of sleep. No, because sleep is part of the time when you're growing those neural connections. So you know, as a learner, you just want to make sure as much as you reasonably can. Good luck if you're a mother with little tiny children at home, but as much as you can, get some sleep. Because what this does is as follows. Let's say you have 5 hours of learning on a particular subject that you can do in a week. Your best idea is to space that out 5 hours, 1 hour per day over 5 days. Instead of cramming it 5 hours all in one day, because if you do that, the connections aren't as strong and your little synaptic janitor can wash or push those patterns away. If you've spaced out your learning, you learn for an hour, sleep that night, strengthens it. So you get like twice the bang for your buck. You get much more effort as a result of that initial learning. Next day, learn for an hour, sleep on it, it's stronger still. Next day, same thing. So when you learn and sleep on it, you're really strengthening those links of memory and your understanding as well. I like to use metaphors. So a good metaphor for this is building a brick wall. If you layer bricks, mortar, bricks, mortar, but before you go too high, you let that mortar dry. So it takes time to learn. And good learning builds a good wall. But if you don't take your time, you get a really poor foundation for learning. So this is a really good metaphor to carry these ideas in your mind. Now, I should give you just a little bit of a sense of the brain's two different important modes of learning. And one, when you're focusing, like I look at you now and you're so totally focused. I'm like, are Romanians always like this? Because you're just really awesome. But you are using a small, concentrated network in your brain when you're focusing. But there's another network in your brain, and that, I'll call it the diffuse mode. So psychologists will often call focus mode task positive network. This is task negative network, or neuroscientists might call this the default mode network. This network is what your brain goes into when it's not doing much of anything at all. When it's resting, you're looking out a window, you're making a cup of tea, you're listening to a song. These kinds of things are what your brain is doing when you're relaxed. And in fact, they found that this network existed because when neuroscience was first beginning to examine what happens in your brain when you're doing math, or you're thinking about a musical instrument, or you're doing something, they had people doing all sorts of different things. But then one time, they were like, okay, hang on a minute while we get set up for this next test that we're going to do. So the person was lying in the scanner, doing nothing. And they realize that, wait a minute, the brain goes into a super different pattern when you're not thinking about anything in particular. So the best way for us to really understand what the difference is between these two patterns is to use a metaphor, another metaphor. And this one is of a pinball machine. So a pinball, if you're my age, you remember how to use a pinball machine. You just pull back on a plunger and a ball goes bouncing around on the rubber bumpers, and that's how you get points. So what we're going to do is we're going to take this pinball machine and we're going to insert it right onto the human brain. Are you ready? Everybody ready? Here we go. Okay. Pinball machine on the brain. And what happens is, let's say you know how to multiply. So you're way ahead of where I was when I was 7 years old. You have these patterns that are laid in your brain by virtue of the fact that you've already learned how to multiply. And if I ask you to multiply like 23 times 47, you might get out a piece of paper or maybe even just do it in your head, but you can follow these patterns and figure that problem out. But what if you're learning something completely new? Let's say you've never studied division before. So there's going to be this pattern that is of division, but the thing is, your brain's used to multiplication. So when you're trying to do division, it's going to slither back up and start working on multiplication. And you can't do that first division problem. You know, the first one that's very difficult, you can't really understand what they're talking about, and you can get so frustrated. And that's what was happening to me, but it even happened to me when I was learning calculus and much more advanced. In fact, it happens to all of us when we're learning something new and very difficult. You get really, really frustrated, and you finally close the book, you walk away. And what happens then is it opens that very different mode of learning, this diffuse mode. And in the diffuse mode, your thoughts range much more broadly. You can't think in the careful, focused way you can when you're in the focused mode, but you can at least get to the new place you need to be in order to understand that mode. So learning often involves going back and forth between focused mode, diffuse mode. Focused, diffuse. You can't really be in both modes at the same time unless, close your ears, you are taking certain forms of mushrooms, and I am not advocating that here. But in any case, these two ways of learning are really important, and they're important because they apply when it comes to procrastination. I know none of you here procrastinates, right? I'm a master procrastinator. So procrastination is actually, it's a worldwide phenomenon. It's something that is so important because when you can procrastinate once or twice. It's no big deal, but you do it very often, and you can even think, oh, I can't learn this subject. I don't have the capability, when you could learn it perfectly fine if you hadn't procrastinated. It's just that few people can learn under the conditions where they're really stressed when they procrastinated. So procrastination arises because when you even just think about something you don't like or don't want to do, it causes pain in the insular cortex. And as a result, this is what your brain does. You think about, your English homework, and you don't want to do it. So you get this, oh no, my English homework, and you turn your attention to something more pleasant. The result, you feel happier. Almost instantly. Of course, once or twice, no big deal. Very often, and it can have a profound influence on your life. So what do you do? How can you handle procrastination? I'm going to jump right to the best trick to use. And that is Francesco Cirillo's Pomodoro technique. And Francesco is an Italian, and Pomodoro stands for tomato. This is like, so I teach a course that is very, very large. And when I say I get tens of thousands of emails, I really do get tens of thousands of emails about this technique saying it changed their life. This is really a helpful technique, and it's helpful in part because it's so simple. All you have to do a Pomodoro is to just simply turn off all distractions, so no ringy-dingies on your cell phone, nothing popping up on your computer. You know, good luck if you have a 2-year-old at home, but do the best you can. Then set your timer for 25 minutes. Focus as intently as you can for those 25 minutes, realizing that your mind is still going to go off on other things, but just get it right back on track. If it's something you need to do, make yourself a little note, because the reality is that anyone can work for 25 minutes. And then at the end, for 5 minutes, reward yourself. So what is this doing? Focus mode for 25 minutes, and then what's happening? Focus, and then 5 minutes of reward. Focus for 25 minutes, 5 minutes of reward. If, maybe 25 minutes is enough with a 5-minute reward. But you can actually do this for 4 sessions, but at the end of the 4th session, give yourself a half an hour break. So this is an effective way to have a 2-hour study period if you want to have that. You might think, but look, I'm losing all this time in between where I'm not thinking about things. But you now understand that learning doesn't just take place when you're focusing. It takes place as well when you're in diffuse mode, when you're in that default mode network. That's when your brain is putting together some of these things you've just learned. So that little break is critical. Now, just a few final little thoughts here. So we talked about how learning involves making connections between neurons. But what happens, though, if you aren't learning? As it turns out, those new neurons, they will shrivel away and die if you're not learning new things. And what's happening is you have this big, you can think of it like a lattice in your brain of neurons. And when you're learning something new, those new neurons that are being born each day in your hippocampus, for example, if you're learning something new, they will survive and thrive and grow. New learning is like a trellis. And those new neurons help you avoid depression. In fact, old neurons, they find it tougher to learn things. And they're also, it's kind of like if you're trying to be more upbeat about life, you want those young neurons to be surviving and thriving and growing. And the best way to do that is through new learning that takes place through your life. So you might ask me, well, yeah, but I'm 60 years old. What can I do to really help me, be better? Or I'm 30 years old, or whatever age you are. I will give you a little hint about how to improve your long-range theta coherence and midline frontal theta. And this has to do with things, this is a fancy set of terms for I get up, I walk down in the kitchen, I open the refrigerator, and I can't remember why I'm even there and doing what I'm doing. So these coherence between these theta waves can actually help you just to remember what you're doing and keep your concentration. The best way people have found to improve learning when you're getting older is through action-style video games. I know mothers are going, oh, the horror. But actually, action-style videos keep your cognition sharp because from an evolutionary perspective, things that can pop out from behind brick buildings and maybe kill you, I mean, that actually makes you be paying attention not only to what you see right in front of you, but also that what's happening on the periphery. And I'll give you an example. So I'm going to give you 3 brains right here. This is from a study in Nature, and I'm going to give you 3 brains. One of these is the average theta coherence, and you can kind of get the idea. The strongest one is the one with the red. One of these brains is 20-year-olds. The second one is 60-year-olds. And the third one is 60-year-olds that have had cognitive training with action-style video games. So, do you have it in mind? Which one's which? Okay, ready? Here we go. 20-year-olds, 60-year-olds, 60-year-olds with cognitive training from action-style video games. Pretty amazing, huh? So, there are some really interesting tricks that even old dogs can learn those new tricks from. So there's fast learners, very, very fast learners. I call them race car learners. And there's hiker learners. Some people are slower learners. But I want you to think about, for the race car, everything goes by in a blur. Hiker learner, they get to the same finish line, but it's a lot slower. But they can reach out, they can touch the leaves on the trees, they smell the pine in the air, hear the birds, completely different experience, and in some ways, far richer and deeper. So you might think, yeah, oh, she's just saying that, what a lovely metaphor, but it's not real. It's real. In fact, there are Nobel Prize winners who are hiker learners. They'd be like, you know, I was studying this stuff and I was so slow. For example, Friedrich Hayek. I was so slow in my learning, and these guys would be learning so much more quickly than I, but because he struggled with his learning, he wouldn't take anything for granted. And he would say, wait a minute, no, look at this little thing. And all the race car learners are going, oh, no, well, yeah, forget that. Come on, we're up here. And he'd be like, no, wait a minute, look here. There's a gap. This isn't right. That's how he won the Nobel Prize, was catching these little things that actually turned out to be big things. What are the differences? Neurally speaking, we can actually see the differences between faster and slower learners. But faster learners, in general, they're very fast. They jump to conclusions, but they're inaccurate. When they're wrong, it's tough for them to change their minds. And they're inflexible. Whereas slower learners, they're a lot slower, but they can be more accurate, and they can flexibly change their mind in what they're learning. So what's really happening is this. We've got our little dendrite here with dendritic spines. As you're learning something new, you learn it, but then that night you go to sleep and you forget. You're a slow learner, you have a different bath of neurochemicals. Some of those dendritic spines get washed away. And the faster learner, on the other hand, they go to sleep at night and this is what they do. They lose like a dendritic spine. You know, they keep their memories. It's really fixed. They can learn much more quickly. But on the other hand, look at this slower learner. They go the next day and they relearn, but they're more flexible about what they're learning. And this flexibility, don't get me wrong, I've known some really, really fast, but also flexible learners. For example, my colleague in teaching, Learning How to Learn, the course, Terry Sinowski, is one of only 12 living human beings who's simultaneously a member of the National Academy of Sciences, of Medicine, and of Engineering of the U.S., in the U.S. Or United States. So he's a super fast learner, but he's also really flexible. But on average, Many smarter, faster learners can struggle with flexibility. So we probably all know people who have dogmatically gotten their beliefs, and it's pretty hard to change them, even though, you know, they're very, very intelligent. So my hero, as we close in science, is Santiago Ramon y Cajal. And Cajal was a terrible learner. I mean, he was just awful. He got kicked out of elementary school. He ended up in jail. He was just, and his father would be like, look, here's this kid, you know, he can't really learn very well, but do the best you can and beat him when he needs to be beaten, which of course didn't help matters. But Santiago, he eventually, believe it or not, studied and became a professor of anatomy. Pretty good, right? But then he went on from there to win the Nobel Prize. Pretty good, huh? But then he went on from there to now be considered the father of modern neuroscience. Cajal was asked, well, you know, how did a guy like you ever end up doing all this stuff? And he said, I was persistent. So he would practice and he would get those ideas. But then he said, I was flexible. He said, when the data told me I was wrong, I could change my mind. He could do exactly what we talk about here, a shift in his mind. But when he said, I was no genius, he was not a genius, but he said, I have worked with many geniuses. And the challenge with geniuses can be that they jump to conclusions, and when they're wrong, they can't change their mind. So if you, like Cajal, are no genius, rejoice, because you can sometimes do things through shifting your mind that even geniuses cannot. With that, I thank you so very much.
Well, let me be the first to say, wow. and thank you so much for being here with us, Barbara, tonight. And let me just say, we were this close to bringing hand grenades to the event, but we didn't. So you can rest assured. So we can maybe take a few questions from the audience if you're curious to hear more from Barbara. Who's going to break the ice? Anyone? Anyone at all?
Barbara, many people talk about hidden potential. I'm very curious, how can we discover our hidden potential? How can we be aware of our potential?
The thing to do is to make yourself uncomfortable, to try something that you just don't feel like you can really do. Because that will uncover some of these hidden gifts. It's hard to uncover hidden gifts when you're doing what you feel comfortable with, because that's where your gifts probably already are. I always say, grow comfortable with feeling uncomfortable. And that can help you. Most people, when they're trying something new, they feel like, oh, I'm an imposter. Everybody else is so much older than I am, or they're so much more gifted than me. But they don't realize that they will always find some hidden gifts about themselves if they just learn. So for example, let's say you're a waitress. I was a waitress once, so I know. I was a very bad waitress. Here's the thing. When I thought, okay, I have to quit, so I'm going to be a very good employee, and I will give them my 2-week notice. And I gave them my 2-week notice, and they said, no, Barb, it's okay. You can quit right now. But when you're a waitress, you don't realize one of your great skills is that you probably know how to speak with people. Let's say you decide you want to learn something about programming. So but you're thinking, oh, all these programmers, they're the ones that were super smart in high school and they can learn all these things very much faster than I can. But guess what? You've got this hidden talent, and the talent is you can actually speak with people because you've worked with people. So your hidden talents are usually really obvious things that you take for granted, but other people may not take for granted when you reach a little bit beyond what you're comfortable with. Okay, more questions? Yes?
Hi, you mentioned the fact that there is a difference between hyper learners and fast learners. How can we teach someone to unlearn their learning process?
How can we teach someone to unlearn their learning process?
Does it make sense?
It absolutely makes sense. And one thing, so I was like, what do I throw out of this presentation? Because I have like 10 hours of presentations that I could give. And one of the things I threw out was, let's see, well, should I show you? I'll show you really quickly. Okay.
So, we have 10 hours left.
Let's see, I thought, well, maybe I'll be lucky enough that someone will ask this question. Okay, so here we go. There's Julius, and Julius is learning how to, throw the javelin by watching a YouTube video. And then here he is, he's throwing a javelin. And in the brain, what's actually going on is he is watching the lecture. That's that blue part right down there. Oops. There's the blue part. He's watching a lecture, and he's practicing, watching and practicing. But this is actually related to what's going on in your brain. When in your brain, and really, I'm going to get to the answer to your question. So I talked about you have to deposit these sets of neural links. What I didn't mention was there's 2 ways to deposit those sets of neural links. And so the first way that you can deposit those links is through the declarative pathway, which takes information from working memory that you're conscious of, that's that octopus, through the hippocampus into long-term memory. The other way is through the basal ganglia into long-term memory. So there's 2 different pathways that you can use to learn something. Now you're going, what does this have to do with unlearning? This declarative through the hippocampal pathway is like I'm explaining to you right now, and you're learning through this pathway. If I said, no, wait a minute, I just said that wrong, I want to change my mind, you could easily change the set of neural links that you've deposited. That's a really flexible system. Let's say I said, I'm actually lying to you about focus and diffuse mode. Diffuse mode is actually called, relinquish mode or something like that. Well, you could rewire what you remember pretty easily. But what you learn through practice, that set of neural links is really inflexible. It makes it super fast. This is how you learn your native language, through that procedural system. So you learn really complex patterns through that system, but they're also really inflexible. So this is why, for example, so my daughter is married to a Chilean. They speak Spanish at home. I want to learn to speak Spanish. So I try to speak a little Spanish, and they begin laughing at me because they say, Mom, you're speaking Spanish with a Russian accent. And it's because I've got those basal ganglia sets of links that make it really, really hard. Those kinds of links make it really inflexible, and it's hard to unlearn those sets of links. This is why when you're learning physics professors will often say, oh, it's so hard to unlearn people's intuition about how the world works because You get this physical intuition. It's not reality, but it's what we've always experienced. And so it's hard to overwrite those. So it depends, unlearning depends a lot on whether you've learned through the declarative or the procedural pathway. Declarative, pretty easy to overwrite and change. Procedural, pretty difficult. So it's a little bit of a complicated answer, but that's the best one I can give. Good question.
So before we get other questions from the audience, I have one for you.
Okay.
And I'm really glad that, and as we were at a radio interview this morning, and I was really glad that you mentioned metaphors, which is one of the big things in all of your techniques. And you know, while you were speaking, maybe a lot of people thought, well, this is a bit ridiculous, using very simple metaphors for basically neuroscience for what you're trying to explain. And I think I speak not just for myself, because we're very used to hearing this in school when we grow up, figuri de stil. So it's why do you think we have this exacerbated feeling of ridicule? Does that keep us from actually evolving? Does that keep us in a constant state of being afraid and not being able to do that?
To learn effectively?
Yeah.
That is a great question. So here's an example. So I was invited to speak at Harvard. I was like this total nervous wreck, because I mean, it's Harvard, you know. I go to Harvard, I'm just this little engineering professor. And, and I start to speak about learning. And you can see the Harvard professors there like, ew. She's using these silly metaphors, zombies and space aliens and all this kind of stuff. And then my husband goes and he points something out to me. He said, look at this graph here. And I looked at the graph, and it was how many students were in all of Harvard's massive open online courses and online courses all together at the whole university. And our single course had on the same order of magnitude as their entire university, our one course. So you think about it. I mean, they're teaching the best in the world. We're teaching everybody. And the fact of the matter is, when you use these simple metaphorical ideas, it can resonate, and people, seemingly ordinary people, not Harvard types, but can really come right on a level with the Harvard learners very, very quickly. So when I wrote the book, my first book about these kinds of ideas, A Mind for Numbers, I reached out to top neuroscientists, top cognitive psychologists, and there's a platform for great professors, or there's a way that you can rate professors called ratemyprofessors.com. I don't know if there's something like that. Anyway, I reached out to thousands of the top professors who were known as outstanding teachers. The one common attribute I found of all of these top professors, no matter what their university, was that they used metaphor to convey key ideas. It makes things so easy. In fact, let's see if let's see if I put it in here. Oh, I did! Oh, yay. Okay. So, when you learn something, let's say you learn how water flows. Okay, you think, oh, water flows, that's simple. But babies, babies will play with water for years because it's actually quite complicated. But once you get that metaphor in mind, look, you can use it as a set of links to much more easily learn a new idea. You just pick key common attributes of your metaphor and whatever you're trying to learn, and you use that to help bridge people onto the new idea much more easily. So metaphors are invaluable in learning. They are never, ever perfect. So whenever a metaphor breaks down, you just throw it away, you get a new metaphor. I mean, yes, If you're using water as a metaphor for electrical current at a quantum level, it is going to break down. So throw it away, get a new metaphor. But good luck finding a metaphor for quantum physics, because it's pretty tough to do.
Well, yeah, but let me just say, I don't know if it's that tough, because I think this is probably a first, at least in the history of Romanian book launches and book-related events. I think you're the first to relate, playing video games with reading and learning. So thank you for that. In people in their 60s, no matter. So yeah, next question. Anyone else?
Hello. Nice to meet you. I attended your course in 2015. So
He is one of the really, really early people then. The course launched August 2014, so you're one of the earliest learners.
yeah, kind of. And I was enthusiastic about your ideas and what you conveyed in there, and I shared with my colleagues in my company. I'm a programmer. But I want to ask you something else. I also have two daughters. One is 2 years, and the older one is 7 years old. And it might be a trivial question, but how would you schedule the children's daily activities, taking into account that, let's say, you want them to learn not faster, but efficiently, let's say.
Okay, so it depends a lot on all the different things you have going on. Are they in school? Are they doing all these things? I'll give you one example that maybe you can use to give you ideas for lots of different things. Do you have this concept in Romania of a tiger mom? Have you heard the tiger mom? So some people are, tiger mom is the mom who's like, my child is going to learn how to do tennis, and they're going to, play the violin, and they're going to, just like learn all. So they have them involved in lots and lots of extracurricular activities, which I think, that's awesome for them, but I'm like too lazy to be a tiger mom. So, let's just call it laid back. I'm too laid back to be a tiger mom. So I decided that for our children, I would be a tiger mother with one paw. And what that really means is I got to choose one thing that I would make my children do. And so I tried to be the good mother. I introduced our daughters, I took them to dance, took them to basketball practice, to learn basketball. They will never forgive me for basketball. And the gymnastics and all these extra, learning the violin and all this stuff. They weren't interested in any of it. They didn't want to do it. They'd do it for like a couple weeks and then they'd quit. But there was one thing that I got to pick that they would do. And that was because I'm a mom who has learned through hard work as an adult that getting a technical background is super valuable in opening all career doors for you. And behind that technical background is math. If you can learn math or have your children be good at math, virtually all career doors are open. If they're good at other things, it's a much narrower path. So I had our daughters, just no matter what else was going on, I had them do 20 minutes extra of math a day. And I used a program called Kumon Mathematics, Kumon, which is in some countries. It's a Japanese-based math program. And there's also a program from Spain called Smartic, Smartic, and that is similar but online. And what this does is it helps students gain that expertise by seeing subtle variations and getting plenty of practice. But it does it in small amounts each day, 20 minutes a day. I would do it most days, have them do this little extra math practice. In many Western countries, there's simply not enough practice with math. So what happens is kids, they get the conceptual understanding, but that means nothing if you don't have those patterns in your brain. Like you can speak your native language or any other language because you've not only learned the ideas, but you've got them embedded through practice in your brain. Math is just like that. So I just used whatever method I had to cajole my kids into doing math that day. So that meant you get a reward for, you get to play a video game you want to play, you get to go to the park, you get to, or whatever it is, I would give them a little reward. Our older daughter, let's just say she was pathetic at math. She was really bad. So it was very, very hard for her. She, it's like, I got 2 bunnies here, and here's 2 more bunnies. How many bunny ears are there? But this little girl, who really, really struggled with math, just finished her medical residency at Stanford. So she would have been one of those little girls that's like, I just don't have the math gene. But that extra practice really helped bring her up. Our older daughter, or our younger daughter, on the other hand, she just always hated math. So our older daughter, she wasn't very good at it, but she'd try. Our younger daughter was just like, I don't even want to try, get it away from me. But I insisted, and she went on, and she wanted to be an artist. She became an artist. She got her bachelor's degree in art, and went out in the working world, and began to realize that math was really her calling. And now she's finishing her master's degree in statistics, and really is getting set up for a nice career through her math. So she's got the art she loves, she's got the math she loves, but she would not have loved it if it hadn't been for a little urging. So I think the philosophy of, if you have one thing, not too much for children, so they still have time for diffuse mode, default mode network, but pick something that, if your family is musical, music might be the thing that you pick. But for me, I could just see so many benefits from a little extra practice in math that they don't get from schools. So I hope that might at least give you a little bit of insight. Small amounts, but day to day. So you get that, practice plus sleep. A good rule of thumb is however old your children are, their attention span is generally that number of years plus 1. So if they're 4 years old, it's 4 years plus 1. 5 is about their attention span. So try not to push them, beyond that during their learning time. Okay.
I never thought I would say this, but you were saying before we started that I can go home and relax after the event, but I think I want to go home and do some math. Any other questions? I have another one. This is a bit more serious. I'm glad you talked about procrastination. I'm glad you said that certain techniques help with depression, because we all know, and I'm sure a lot of us, some of us maybe were predisposed before the pandemic to a depression or to something even more serious. That certainly exacerbated it and accelerated the process. I, for one, for example, found myself not being able to read for almost a year. I don't know if you realize I work in the book industry. But yeah, I would go on YouTube, I would go on ZombieTube, and I would try to find instant gratification. I think that Google algorithm, if it would try to figure out what my interests are, they're all over the place on YouTube, because I just try to find that instant gratification of watching, learning sometimes a lot of things. But why do we choose to go to that instant gratification when we're procrastinating instead of pushing on the brake and saying, okay, what do I need to do here?
Oh, that's a good question. First off, I want to make it clear that going and just messing around online and randomly looking at stuff is not necessarily a bad thing.
Good to know.
Yeah, and because we're often told, okay, we need to focus. We're going to do deep work. Don't get me wrong. I really like Cal Newport's book by the same name. But as it turns out, if you want to be more creative, people who will work away, but then kind of go off to the internet and kind of drift around a little bit, it often helps with creativity. And you can see, you know, you're getting into focus mode, you're really getting deeper and deeper, but often being creative means being broader too. And so taking those little breaks and, you know, and messing around online is a good thing. I think the challenge is that when things are really in disarray, as with COVID, it can be hard, you can lose sight, and you can end up spending, you know, many hours, many days, months, where you're just kind of randomly poking around. And it can be helpful to take yourself in hand, take a step back and say, okay, I've been doing this for a couple months or maybe a couple years, but it's time to look at where I really want to be going and then set aside some time to do that. And using this Pomodoro technique to get yourself started, what I personally find is when I am getting off of a break period where I've been spending a couple weeks or something like that, just it's really hard, it's painful. But if I just break it up into, I'm just gonna do a Pomodoro today, actually you start getting, just give yourself a couple days, a few weeks to get back into things, and it will flow. It will begin to flow.
I'll remember that the next time I start watching random furniture building videos. Okay, any last questions? Curiosities? Complaints? Yes.
First of all, thank you very much for your nice presentation. And, I'm really glad to see you here in Romania. I took the course in Coursera 2 years ago, I think, and after that I get the book. And I was really impressed about it. And it was a really surprise when I get the email yesterday or 2 days ago and said that Professor Oakley is in Romania. So maybe I didn't read well, I read again. It's here, it's okay, I have to go at least to see her in person. I have 2 questions. First one is regarding the teaching, the methods. Which do you think is more, the learning methods is more effective in preserving and developing the brain capacity to learn? It's like learning languages, playing chess, playing an instrument, learning more kinds of maths, as you told, or also combining with social science. From your experience, which of this is most effective in preserving in long term this capacity of learning?
That's such a great question, and the answer is all of those things.
They are not.
I wouldn't put a hierarchy, except in the case that, you know, if you're looking at maybe enhancing your career, just kind of look at what might be enhancing as well as personally satisfying. And that might be learning a language, for example, or it might be learning in coding or math or photography, whatever might enhance your career. But actually just learning anything new can help those new neurons survive, thrive, and grow.
Okay, thank you. And the second one, which was really, I was really happy when I heard about video games study. I was back in my 20s and say, okay, now I have a good argument to go back to my old habits. And I want to ask you, in that study, they are saying what kind of games like strategy or action, or if there is any classified type of games, which, because I think not all types of...
And can we find them on Steam?
Exactly.
So that's a great question, and the fact is that really the study of games is still in its infancy. So there are, I don't know, there's something like over a dozen different categories of game types. There's action style, strategy, and social learning. So there's lots of different kinds. The ones that have been found to enhance cognition the best, but this does not necessarily mean deep strategy type learning. So the ones that enhance cognition are action style video games that shoot 'em up action style, like Grand Theft Auto and so forth. Those really work well for that. And the researchers who found this were kind of horrified. It's kind of like, this is the last thing we expected to find, was that your cognition would be enhanced with this. But it does make sense that you're learning to look ahead, but also watch your peripheral vision. You're thinking about, okay, yeah, and I'm with my team, and and we have to, we've got to gang up on this other team or something like that. It's actually enhancing a lot of different skills, but particularly those cognitive processes of being visually aware of different kinds of things that are unfolding. But for example, strategy games like chess, I think it's intuitively obvious to all of us that it does do some sort of deep learning and that it enhances deep learning. But so far, researchers are finding mixed results about whether learning chess, for example, can transfer to helping you learn languages, and that kind of thing. It does enhance your deep strategy skills. For me, what I did find, though, is I learned I learned a language. I learned at the Defense Language Institute, which is one of the top language learning institutes in the world. And I learned that I want to practice and interleave different, so like I'm learning a verb conjugation, I want to be able to quickly conjugate a verb without even thinking about it. What if I apply that same idea to learning how to do a problem with circuits? So I'm learning different, oftentimes what students will do is they will do a homework set and turn in their homework set. And they'll just do that problem like that one time. I would take a problem and say, I'm going to learn this in the same way I learned a language. I'm going to be able to look at the wording of the problem, and just like you can look at a verb, like to go, ir in Spanish, and I'm going to be able to conjugate it in my mind very quickly. Well, why don't I look at that problem in circuits and be able to solve it really quickly in my mind, intuitively, so I know step by step and I can do it really quickly. When I use that same technique I'd used to learn a language to learning in math and science, that's how I became successful. So even though they often say that learning doesn't transfer, there's deep evidence from the work of Daphne Bavelier and other brilliant researchers in game studies that there is some sort of deep learning that does take place when you're learning something that does help you transfer that learning to other things. But still, I don't think I'm fully answering your question at all. But it is to say that researchers are starting to work in this area. They're doing some really great work. The best they're finding now relates to these action-style video games, but there will be more. There are spatial games like Tetris, so the shapes falling. This does help with spatial ability. And people often will think, I couldn't be an engineer because I can't do mental transformations. I can't move things around. But actually, you can learn to do this skill. For example, for me, learning language at first, I couldn't do any, transform a circuit diagram, forget it. But after practicing a lot with it, now I can look at a circuit diagram, flip it in my head, And spatial skills can be learned, and games can really help with that. Daphne Bavelier says something I think which is brilliant, which is applying learning, using video games to help with learning in education is like mixing chocolate with broccoli and coming up with something that's tasty. It's very difficult to do, but people are working on that. So it's going to be fantastic to see what unfolds in the years to come.
So I think it's safe to say that people will go home and will either do maths, DIY, or play CSGO.
Or have a diffuse mode break, but use that retrieval practice as well.
Well, on that bombshell, Barbara, I'd like to thank you so much once again for this very insightful presentation, for inciting our minds, for, well, just being here. And I know you told me that you're falling in love with Romania. Give us a few weeks. Don't be so sure about that, but I'm really glad you're here. I don't know what else to say. This was absolutely amazing, and I'm really glad that we started off this season of events after the pandemic with your event and with your book, and hopefully we'll see you again soon, maybe sooner than we thought, maybe, who knows. Thank you again so much. Vă mulțumesc și eu încă o dată din partea Carte Veche Publishing. Vreau să le mulțumesc foarte, foarte mult și partenerilor noștri, în primul rând minunaților colegi de la Humanitas, de la Librăriile Humanitas. Ruxandra, mulțumim că ne suporți. Mulțumesc talentaților librari și librărese de la Librăria Humanitas Cișmigiu, care mereu sunt atât de primitori și primitoare și care din nou ne suportă. Mulțumim BIZ, mulțumim Facultății de Comunicare din cadrul SNSPA, mulțumim Hotel Sheraton și partenerului nostru de tradiție Clar Media. Găsiți cartea în spate, Barbara vă va oferi acum autografe, mulțumesc mult încă o dată și sper să ne vedem la cât mai multe evenimente de genul ăsta, cât mai curând. Barbara, thanks again so much. One more round of applause.